My name is Michael, and when I was 12 years old, I lived with my parents in a typical suburban home. It was a comfortable two-story house where I had my own room downstairs. The room was small but sufficient for me, with a low bed, a desk, and some shelves for my books and games. I used to enjoy my space. Life was peaceful. The neighborhood was safe, and the nights were quiet, with only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside or the creaking of the old wooden house. Then, suddenly, I began waking up in the middle of the night. There wasn't a clear reason. At first, I would just open my eyes, feeling an inexplicable discomfort. Everything seemed normal, but something was different. Something was bothering me. Over time, the feeling of discomfort grew stronger. Waking up in the middle of the night became an unwelcome habit. I started taking precautions, checking every corner of the room before bed, including the space under the bed. Everything seemed normal, but the fear persisted. I couldn't talk about it with my parents. It was hard to explain that I, a 12-year-old boy, was scared of my own room without it sounding like childish nonsense. The nights only got worse. I started hearing sounds, a soft dragging, a muffled whisper. My mind told me it was just the wind, but my body reacted with fear. Even after checking the room multiple times, the fear wouldn't go away. Sleep, once a refuge, became a nightmare I couldn't escape. The simple act of lying in bed was terrifying. I avoided looking under the bed, convinced that something or someone might be hiding there. Then, one of those nights, everything changed. I woke up with the feeling that something was very wrong. The room was engulfed in darkness, with only a small beam of light filtering through the curtains. I remained still, trying to understand what was happening, until I heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound. Something was moving slowly, as if trying not to be noticed. My heart raced, and I felt panic rising. With trembling hands, I pulled the blanket aside and leaned out of bed. The distance between me and the floor seemed infinite as I slowly bent down. Finally, peering under the bed, I saw two eyes gleaming in the dim light, fixed on me. It was a man, large, filthy, with a wild expression. He was lying there, curled up like an animal, and he smiled at me, a twisted smile that froze my blood. I couldn't scream. My body froze completely. I bolted out of the room in one swift motion and ran to my parents' room, screaming for help. My father jumped out of bed immediately, and I ran into his arms, pointing to my room, unable to form coherent words. My father rushed to my room, and I followed him despite the terror. He turned on the light, and for a second, everything seemed normal. But when he lifted the bedspread, he saw the man still under the bed, staring intently at us. My father yelled at the man to get out, but he didn't move. A desperate struggle ensued. My father finally managed to pin the man down, pressing his body against the floor. My mother, in shock, called the police. When the officers arrived, they quickly handcuffed the man and took him away. Even with the intruder out of the house, the fear didn't leave. Something inside me had changed forever. After that night, nothing felt safe anymore. Even with the man in jail, the trauma remained rooted deep inside me. Every shadow in the room, every faint noise, brought back the memory of that night. I was moved to a room upstairs, but that didn't help. The trauma had already taken hold. I developed an obsession with checking every corner of the room before bed, but the feeling of being watched never completely disappeared. As I grew older, the fear manifested in different ways. The simple act of sleeping, which should have been a moment of peace, always brought back that primal fear. Even after so many years, I still find myself hesitant to look under the bed, as if, in some corner of my mind, I still believe I might find those wild eyes staring back at me. And perhaps that's the worst part of all, knowing that fear can hide in the most unlikely places, waiting to surface when you least expect it. My great-grandfather, Mikhail, rarely spoke about the war. He had served in the Red Army during World War II, fighting on the Eastern Front. He was a tough man, hardened by the horrors he had witnessed. But even he, who had faced countless atrocities, carried a memory that haunted him until his last days. He would often start the story by saying that the battle had been particularly bloody that night. It was winter, and the air was freezing, cutting like knives. Mikhail and his friend Alexei were among the few who survived a brutal combat with the German forces. After the chaos, the battlefield fell silent, except for the occasional groans of the wounded and the distant sound of the wind howling through the forest. Exhausted, Mikhail and Alexei finally found a place to rest, sitting amidst the wreckage of war. As they tried to catch their breath, something broke the silence of the night, a long, piercing scream coming from the dark forest ahead of them. They exchanged glances, their fatigue momentarily forgotten, replaced by a wave of apprehension. "Did you hear that?" Alexei asked, his voice low and tense. Mikhail just nodded, his eyes fixed on the dense darkness of the forest. The scream sounded human, but there was something wrong with it, something that made their skin crawl and their chests tighten. Against better judgment, they decided to investigate. Perhaps it was a wounded soldier or someone in trouble. With their rifles ready and lanterns in hand, they advanced toward the sound, entering the cold, dark forest. Every step echoed on the dry branches under their feet, and the silence between the screams made everything even more sinister. The forest seemed like another world, where the cold penetrated to the bone and the shadows seemed alive. The deeper they went into the darkness, the denser the air became, as if nature itself was trying to prevent their passage. The fear was there, growing with every step, but they kept going. Something pushed them forward, a need to know what was happening on that cold, dark night. But at the same time, there was a premonition, a sense that they were getting closer to something they were never meant to find. Mikhail and Alexei advanced cautiously, each trying to keep their breathing controlled, while the screams grew quieter, closer. The trees around them seemed to close in, as if the forest was enveloping them, wanting to keep them trapped there. The sound of their own footsteps mixed with distant echoes, creating a disturbing symphony in the night. Finally, Alexei's lantern illuminated a small clearing among the trees. What they saw there made them stop in their tracks. In the center of the clearing lay two German soldiers. One of them was dead, his body horribly mutilated, almost unrecognizable. Parts of his uniform were torn, and his face was twisted in an expression of indescribable agony. Blood covered the ground around him, spreading like a dark stain on the white snow. The other soldier was alive, but in a wretched state. He was slumped against a tree, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. He was muttering something incomprehensible, his words a blur of fear and pain. Mikhail didn't understand German, but he didn't need to. The terror on the man's face said it all. He was terrified, as if he had seen something beyond human comprehension. Alexei approached, trying to speak to the man, but his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The German soldier continued to murmur, pointing to the darkness between the trees, as if begging them not to leave him there. The fear in the air was almost palpable, and Mikhail felt a chill run down his spine. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. As they tried to make sense of what had happened, an unexpected sound broke the silence. It was a crack, like a branch snapping, coming from the darkness around the clearing. Mikhail and Alexei immediately raised their rifles, turning towards the sound, their hearts pounding. And then, among the shadows of the trees, they saw a tall, skeletal figure moving quickly. It was hard to make out its contours in the darkness, but it was large, abnormally tall, and moved with a speed and grace that didn't seem human. The figure darted between the trees, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared, but leaving a deep mark of terror on both men. The German soldier began to scream desperately, his voice cutting through the cold night air. He seemed to know what he had seen, and his panic only intensified the fear already growing inside Mikhail and Alexei. Whatever that thing was, it was not natural. That's when they realized they were completely alone in the forest, far from the rest of their troop, with something terrifying lurking in the shadows. Panic gripped us. That German soldier's scream echoed in our ears, amplifying the fear that had already taken root in our hearts. Alexei and I didn't exchange words. There was no need. We both knew we had to get out of there immediately. Still, our feet seemed glued to the ground, as if the earth itself was holding us captive, forcing us to confront whatever was lurking in the darkness. The skeletal figure had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but the feeling that it was still nearby was overwhelming. The German soldier, despite his dire state, tried to stand, but his injuries held him back. He kept muttering, pointing to where the creature had disappeared, as if warning us of an imminent danger. It was Alexei who broke the spell of fear. He grabbed my arm, his eyes wide, and murmured, "We have to go, Mikhail, now." I didn't hesitate. We turned our backs on that terrifying scene and started running, not caring about the noise we made. The forest, which had seemed like a dark maze before, now felt like a deadly trap, with every tree, every shadow, hiding something malevolent. As we ran, we heard more sounds behind us, branches snapping, quick footsteps that weren't ours. I didn't look back, but I could feel that thing getting closer. It was as if the night itself was closing in on us, trying to swallow us whole. Finally, we saw the faint lights of the camp in the distance, and the fear of being caught gave way to a burst of adrenaline. We ran faster, our hearts pounding in our ears, until we finally emerged from the forest and collapsed, exhausted, on the ground at the camp. We couldn't say anything, just lay there, gasping for breath, while the other soldiers gathered around, worried and curious. We never told them what we had really seen that night. When the officers asked, we said we had found 2 Germans, one dead and the other badly injured, and that we were attacked by something in the forest, but we couldn't say what it was. No one pressed us for more details, and soon the story became just another war tale, lost among so many others. But for me and Alexei, that night was never forgotten. Whenever I saw Alexei after that, there was a silent understanding between us, a memory of what we had witnessed and the terror that had accompanied us in those moments. Even now, so many years later, the memory of that tall, skeletal figure running through the darkness still gives me chills. My great-grandfather never knew what that thing in the forest was. He said that of all the horrible experiences he had in the war, that was the one that haunted him the most. And whenever he spoke of this story, the shadow of that fear seemed to return, as if it were lurking, waiting to be remembered. And perhaps, he thought, some things in war were worse than death itself. Things that lurked in the shadows, waiting, hunting. Things that, even on a battlefield where life was disposable, could sow a terror so deep it never fully went away. Emily and I were excited. We had just moved into our first home together in a small, quiet town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and the nights were peaceful. The house was charming, perfect for starting this new chapter of our lives. It had a spacious backyard surrounded by trees where we planned to spend pleasant evenings, maybe having barbecues or just relaxing. The first few days were pure bliss. We spent our time setting up the house, choosing furniture, and getting familiar with the neighborhood. The place had a calmness that captivated us. The backyard, in particular, had become our favorite retreat. It was a wide space with comfortable chairs and a table where we enjoyed our morning coffee. That particular night, after a long day of work and setting up the house, we decided to relax a bit. Emily stayed inside making some tea while I went out to the backyard to enjoy the fresh air. It was dark, but the silence was comforting, broken only by the gentle rustle of the leaves in the wind. That's when I saw him. Sitting in one of the garden chairs was a man I had never seen before. He was there, as if he owned the place, staring at the house with an expression I couldn't immediately decipher. The man was strange, with disheveled clothes and messy hair, clearly out of place in that tranquil setting. My heart started racing, and my first reaction was confusion. How had he gotten in without me noticing? Why was he sitting in my backyard at night, as if it were normal? "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep calm. "Who are you and what are you doing here?" The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slowly turned toward me, and his eyes, dark and empty, locked onto mine. There was a heavy silence, where the air seemed to thicken around us. Finally, he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, but something twisted that made me uncomfortable. "Just enjoying the night," he said in a low, almost whispered voice. That answer made no sense. Who trespasses into someone else's backyard in the middle of the night to enjoy the night? Something was terribly wrong, and I knew I needed to get that man out of there, but a cold, creeping sense of danger started spreading through me. I was about to tell him to leave, but before I could say anything, he started speaking again. This time his tone changed, becoming lower, more menacing. And somehow, he knew that Emily was inside the house. His words froze me. "She's beautiful, your fiancée. I saw her through the window," he said, his voice hissing with malice. His smile widened, as if enjoying the fear his words caused. "Emily, right? You two look so happy." It would be a shame if something happened to her. Ice ran through my veins. How did he know her name? How did he know about us? The terror I felt turned into a growing rage. I wasn't going to let the stranger threaten Emily. Not here, not in our home. "You need to leave now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll call the police if you don't go." He didn't seem worried. In fact, he laughed, a low, sarcastic laugh that only heightened my sense of helplessness. "Call the police," he replied. "I'm not afraid of them, but you should be afraid of what can happen when they're not here." The way he said that made my stomach turn. I wanted to end it right there, to force him out, but something told me he was more dangerous than he appeared, so I took a step back, not taking my eyes off him, and began retreating towards the glass door that led to the house. I needed to protect Emily. As soon as I opened the door and stepped inside, the man slowly stood up from the chair, the smile still fixed on his face. "I'll give you a chance to leave before I do something you'll regret," I said, trying to sound threatening, but the truth was that fear was growing inside me. I shut the door and locked it quickly, not taking my eyes off him through the glass. He stood there for a moment, staring at me, and then, finally, he turned and started walking toward the back of the yard. But before disappearing into the darkness, he turned once more, casting one last look at the house, his eyes shining with a silent promise that this wasn't over. My breath was heavy as I locked all the doors and windows, trying to keep my hands steady. Emily came to me, worried after hearing bits of the conversation. "What was that? Who was that man?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice tense. "But he didn't seem normal. We need to call the police, now." We called immediately, and the police arrived quickly. 2 officers searched the yard and the surrounding area but found no sign of the man. They told us to stay calm, that it was probably just a disturbed person who wouldn't come back, but I knew it wasn't that simple. There was something about that man, in the way he talked, the way he looked at Emily, that told me this wasn't over, and the thought that he might come back left us completely on edge. The hours dragged on that night, and neither of us could sleep. Emily was visibly scared, and I tried to stay calm, but the fear that the man would return was paralyzing. The house, which had been our refuge, now felt like a place full of threats. Every creak of the wood, every distant sound, made my heart race. It was past 2 in the morning when we heard a sound that made us freeze. A faint noise, almost imperceptible, coming from the back door. I got up slowly, signaling Emily to stay where she was. I grabbed the gun I kept in the bedroom, a precaution I never thought I'd actually need to use. As I reached the kitchen, I heard the noise again, but this time louder, like something scraping against the door. With my heart pounding, I approached slowly. Through the small window in the door, I could see a shadow moving outside. My blood ran cold when I realized it was him. The man was back, and this time, he seemed determined to get in. The doorknob rattled as he tried to force it open. "Emily, call the police," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. She ran to grab the phone while I stood there, facing the door, the rifle in my hands, trying to control the rising panic. The doorknob stopped moving, and everything went silent for a moment. I thought he might have given up, but then I heard a noise at the windows. He was moving around the house, trying to find a way in. The sound of his footsteps on the porch, the scratching of his nails on the glass, it all made my head spin. He was toying with us, testing our defenses, waiting for the right moment to strike. Finally, the red and blue lights of the police illuminated the street, and the sounds suddenly stopped. I cautiously opened the front door, and to my relief, I saw the officers approaching. I ran to them, explaining what was happening. They began searching the yard and the area around, and that's when they spotted him. The man was trying to flee, but the officers quickly caught up to him and detained him. He didn't resist, but the look on his face was pure hatred. Even as he was being handcuffed, he glared at us, as if promising that this wasn't the end. After he was taken away, one of the officers returned and gave us more information. We learned that the man lived in an old house nearby, isolated at the end of the street. He had a violent history, with several run-ins with the police for aggressive behavior. The authorities considered him dangerous, but he had never gone this far before. They couldn't guarantee he would be kept in custody for long, but they promised to increase patrols in the area. Despite that, the sense of security we had felt when we moved into that house was completely gone. The idea that he could still be around, waiting for a chance to come back, was unbearable. I knew we had to make a tough decision. In the days that followed, the fear didn't subside. Emily and I talked a lot about what to do. and we finally decided that we couldn't live there anymore. It wasn't fair to live with that constant feeling of vulnerability, always looking over our shoulders, waiting for the worst. That house, which had once been our dream, was now a place that only brought fear. We put the house up for sale and started looking for another place to live in a different town, far away from that nightmare. And although time may pass, the face of that man, the way he looked at us, will never fade from my memory. He stole our peace, and the fear that he might return one day continues to haunt us, wherever we are. When my wife Clara and I bought our first home, we were thrilled to finally have a place of our own. It was a small country house, surrounded by tall trees on a quiet cul-de-sac. It was the perfect place to start a family. The neighbors were friendly, and everything seemed ideal. In the first week, we met almost everyone on the street. There was an elderly couple next door and a young family across the street. However, the house directly in front of ours seemed unoccupied. The curtains were always closed, and we never saw anyone going in or out. One afternoon, Clara suggested we should try to meet whoever lived there, so we crossed the street and knocked on the door. We waited a few minutes, but no one answered. Just as we were about to head back home, the door opened slightly. A tall man with gray hair and pale skin peeked out through the crack. "Yes?" he said in a low, raspy voice. "Hi, we're your new neighbors. We live right across the street. We just wanted to introduce ourselves," Clara said with a friendly smile. The man didn't reply right away. His eyes seemed to scrutinize every detail about us. Finally, he muttered, "Keep your curtains closed at night." Before we could ask anything else, he shut the door. We stood there for a moment, confused and a bit unsettled. Later that night, Clara laughed off the situation, saying he was probably just an eccentric old man. I agreed, trying to shake off the strange feeling of discomfort the encounter had left me with. In the following weeks, we began to notice odd things. At night, when the lights were off, we could see a faint light flickering in the neighbors' windows. Sometimes we heard low, continuous noises, like someone tapping on something metallic. But the most disturbing thing was the constant feeling of being watched. Often, I'd look over at the house and see the man's silhouette behind the curtains, watching us. One night, after watching a movie on the couch, Clara went to bed early, and I stayed in the living room tidying up. When I got up to turn off the lights and close the curtains, I noticed a figure outside in the yard, standing near the fence that separated our houses. It was the neighbor, staring directly at our window. My heart raced. He was completely still, just watching us. Not knowing what to do, I approached the window and asked through the glass if he needed something. He didn't respond, but I saw his lips move, murmuring something I couldn't understand. I quickly turned off the lights, closed the curtains, and went upstairs, trying not to alarm Clara. During the night, I heard knocking on our bedroom window. It was soft, almost rhythmic, like someone gently tapping with their fingers. Clara was sleeping soundly, so I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind. But the knocking continued. Finally, I mustered the courage to peek through the curtain. In the darkness, I could just make out the outline of a pale hand pressed against the glass. My instincts kicked in, and I quickly pulled Clara out of bed, called the police, and locked all the doors and windows. When the police arrived, the man was gone. They searched the area but found no signs of a break-in, just handprints on the windows and footprints around the house. They said it was probably just a drifter, but we knew who it was. The next day, we decided to investigate the neighbor's house. The curtains were still drawn, but we noticed something we hadn't seen before. There were several scratches on the front door, as if someone had desperately tried to claw their way in. We looked through the windows and, for a brief moment, saw a pair of eyes staring back at us before they disappeared into the darkness. We decided to move out shortly after. We never found out what was really going on in that house. But the memories of the knocking on the window and the man watching us still haunt us. When my wife Anna and I moved into our new home, we were excited to start a new chapter in our lives. The house was spacious with a large garden, and best of all, it had a basement I could convert into my office. Everything seemed perfect, except for one detail. The basement had a locked door that the previous owner said he'd never been able to open. In the first few days, we didn't pay much attention to it. We were busy unpacking and getting to know the neighbors. Everyone seemed normal, except for the man who lived next door. He was reserved, and every night we'd see him leave his house and return late, always carrying large, heavy bags. One night, while I was organizing the basement, I heard a low, steady sound coming from the other side of the locked door. It sounded like a hum, almost as if someone were murmuring something. I called Anna, but when she came down, the sound stopped. She said it was probably just the old house's plumbing. I decided to ignore it and continued tidying up. A few days later, I decided to investigate the locked door. I bought some tools to try and force the lock, but it turned out to be more resistant than I'd expected. My curiosity kept growing, especially since the humming continued, getting louder and more frequent, always at night. One night, while Anna was asleep, I decided to go down to the basement and try to open the door again. This time, I heard something clearer. It sounded like something scratching on the other side of the door. My heart raced, but I pressed on. I used a crowbar to force the lock, and finally, the door gave way. What I found on the other side chilled me to the bone. The basement didn't end there, as we'd thought. There was a narrow hallway that led further down under the house. The humming was louder, and now I could hear what sounded like whispers in a language I couldn't understand. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me and turned quickly, but no one was there. I shut the door hastily and went back to bed, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The next day, I went to talk to the neighbor, trying to act casually. I asked if he knew anything about the basement in our house, but he just gave me a strange smile and said, "Some doors are better left closed." That unsettled me even more. That night, the noise in the basement grew more intense. This time it sounded like something or someone was trying to open the door from the inside. I went down again, a mix of fear and determination driving me. When I got to the basement, I saw that the door I'd opened was slightly ajar, even though I was sure I'd shut it tightly. As I approached, the door slowly swung open. There, in the hallway, I saw a shadowy figure, almost human but distorted, standing in the darkness. The whispers were deafening now, and I felt a malevolent presence pulling me in. I ran up the stairs, locking the basement door behind me, and woke Anna. I told her we needed to leave immediately. Without questioning, she grabbed our things and we left the house in the dead of night. When we returned with the police the next morning, the basement was completely empty. There was no hallway, no shadowy figure, just a closed door that no one could open. We never went back to that house. To this day, the sound of whispers haunts me, and I wonder what really lay beyond that locked door.